nature of man is complicated, and very much of what actually goes on within the human being remains more or less beneath the threshold of consciousness, merely sending its effects up into consciousness. True self-knowledge cannot be won without first obtaining insight into the working of the subconscious, weaving below the surface in the impulses of soul. These, it could be said, move in the depths of the ocean of consciousness and come to the surface only in the wake of the waves they create. Ordinary consciousness can perceive only the waves that rise to the surface. And on the whole, one is not capable of understanding their significance. So true self-knowledge is not possible. Merely pondering on what is washed up into consciousness does not lead to self-knowledge. For things in the depths of the soul often differ greatly from what they become in ordinary everyday consciousness. Today we shall look a little into this nature of man in order to gain, from this point of view, an idea of how the subconscious soul impulses in the human being really work. In this field we can, of course, to a greater or lesser extent, speak only in pictures. But if you bring together much of what we have hitherto discussed within our anthroposophical movement, you will be able to understand the realities that want to speak through the pictures. We can say, the invisible nature of man, his ego, his astral body, his etheric body, work through his visible nature. So what is not manifest works through what is manifest. However, the manner in which what is evident works through what is not evident is very complicated. But if we work our way bit by bit through the various parts of this complicated process and place them all together, we shall in the end attain an overall view of the being of man. Even this, though, will always remain incomplete, for the being of man is infinitely complex. But at least we can gain a certain basic knowledge of human nature as a valid foundation for self-knowledge. Today we shall examine how the separate components of man's nature express themselves in a more or less pictorial or formalized manner through physical life. Here is a human being. To illustrate what I want to tell you, I shall start with what we recognize for earthly man as the aspect of which we are conscious, the ego. I must emphasize that pictorial explanations can very easily lead to misunderstandings, because things said earlier seem to contradict other things said later. Follow carefully, and you will soon notice that such contradictions are in fact non-existent. So, let us start with the ego nature of man, with that component we call our ego. This ego nature is, of course, entirely supersensible. It is the most supersensible part we have as yet acquired. But it works through the physical. In the intellectualistic sense, the ego works in our physical being chiefly through the nervous system, which is called the system of ganglia, the nervous system radiating from the solar plexus. Diagrammatically, we can indicate this nervous system, this system of ganglia, this system of the solar plexus thus, and there's a diagram, dark shading. It is active in a way which at first glance does not appear to have much to do with what in a materialistic sense we could call the life of the nerves. Yet it is the actual point of contact for real ego activity. This is not a contradiction of the fact that when we begin to see ourselves spiritually, we have to seek the center of the ego in the head. Since the ego component of the human being is supersensible, the point at which we experience our ego is not the same as the point at which it chiefly works in us. We must be quite clear what we mean when we say the ego works through the point of contact of the solar plexus. What it means is this. The ego itself is equipped with only a very dull consciousness. The ego thought is not the same as the ego. The ego thought is what is washed up into consciousness, but the ego thought is not the real ego. The real ego intervenes as a formative force in the whole human organism through the solar plexus. Certainly you can say that the ego distributes itself over the whole body, but its main point of contact, where it particularly intervenes in the formative element of the human organism, is the solar plexus. A better expression would be the system of ganglia, because all the ramifications are part of this process, the system of ganglia. It is a process that lives in the subconscious and works in this system of ganglia. Since the system of ganglia plays its part in the circulation of blood as well, this does not contradict the fact that the ego expresses itself in the blood. The exact meaning of everything that is said must be considered. It is one thing to say, the ego intervenes through the system of ganglia in the formative forces and in all the life processes of the organism, but something else is meant when we say the blood with its circulation is an expression of the ego in the human being. The nature of the human being is, as I said, complicated. To understand the significance of what has been said, it will be useful to answer the following question. What is the relationship of the ego with the system of ganglia and all that is connected with it? How is this ego anchored, as it were, in the abdominal organs of the human being? When the human being is in a normal state of health, the ego is chained to the solar plexus and all that is connected with it. It is bound by the solar plexus. What does this mean? This human ego, given to man during the course of earthly evolution as a gift from the spirits of form, has been, as we know, subjected to the temptation of Lucifer. The ego, as it now exists in man, and because it has been infected by Luciferic forces, would be a bearer of evil forces. The truth of this fact must definitely be recognized. The ego is not a bearer of evil forces because of its own nature, but because it has become infected with Luciferic forces through the temptation by Lucifer. It is in fact the bearer of truly evil forces, forces which, because of the Luciferic infection, tend to distort the thought life of the ego toward evil. Since the moment when the ego was given to him, man has been able to think. If there had been no Luciferic temptation, man would think only good thoughts about everything. But as the Luciferic temptation did in fact take place, the ego does not think good thoughts, but thoughts infected by Lucifer. This is a fact of earthly evolution. The ego is malicious and dastardly. It thinks only of showing itself in a good light and consigning everything else to the shadow. It is infected with all kinds of egoisms. This is how it is, because it is infected by Lucifer. Now, the system of ganglia, the solar plexus, is something in man that has come over from the moon incarnation of the earth. It is a kind of house for the ego. The ego fits into it in a certain way. In fact, it can be held a prisoner there. So, we have the following state of affairs. Because of its Luciferic infection, the ego tends all the time to behave in a dastardly, lying manner and place itself in the light while consigning everything else to the shade. But it is held prisoner by the nervous system of the abdomen. There it has to behave itself. By means of the nervous system of the abdomen, the properly progressing forces, which have come to us from ancient Saturn, Sun, and Moon, compel the ego not to be a demon in the bad sense of the word. So the manner in which we bear our ego within us is to have it bound by the organs of the abdomen. Assume now that these abdominal organs are unhealthy in some way, or not in a normal state. Not to be in a normal state means not to want to take in fully what fits into them spiritually, what spiritually belongs to them. The ego can be somewhat freer in its activity if the abdominal organs are not quite healthy. If this freeing is brought about by some physical hyperactivity, this can express itself in a human being in that the ego is let loose on the external world instead of remaining bound. When the ego behaves freely in this way, we have a case of psychological illness. The human being displays the characteristics of the ego infected by Lucifer. The characteristics of the ego of which I have spoken then make their appearance. There is certainly no need to be a materialist in order to understand fully the manner in which the spiritual, in this case the ego, can be bound to physical organs in life between birth and death, though in a way that differs from what is perceived by a materialist. There is no need to be a materialist to see how, in a manner of speaking, the devil can throw off his chains and break loose. This is one instance of psychological illness. The freeing
Link in the
of the ego,
description.
however, is not necessary.